Welcome to This Explainer. You know, traditional history classes spend a ton of time on a pretty short list of major milestones. But today, we're diving into 13 overlooked and unsettling chapters of American history that almost always get cut from standard classroom curricula. We're going to explore the marginalized narratives, violent massacres, systemic racial injustices, and unethical human experiments that textbooks deliberately leave out. The goal? To challenge that sanitized version of our national past and really understand the enduring consequences of institutional prejudice.
So I want you to consider this question for a second. What exactly gets cut from your history textbook? As we go through these chapters today, ask yourself how massacres, unethical human experiments, and broken government promises have been systematically omitted from our education. I mean, why are certain communities' tragedies just erased? History isn't just what we remember, right? It's absolutely also what we've been taught to forget. Section 1. Exploited labor and scapegoating. When we look back at the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a really clear pattern of violence and exclusion emerges. Take 1871, for example. A mob of roughly 500 people in Los Angeles lynched at least 17 Chinese men and boys. 8 men were convicted, but get this, every single conviction was overturned on a technicality. Fast forward to 1885 in Rock Springs, Wyoming. White miners killed at least 28 Chinese coal workers over wage disputes, literally burning their homes to the ground. The company faced zero consequences. Neither did the killers. And then, in 1934, the Tydings-McDuffie Act essentially trapped a whole generation of Filipino farm workers in America. Classified as aliens and barred by anti-miscegenation laws from marrying white women, this Manong generation was forced to grow old entirely alone as bachelors. Speaking of that generation, there's a pivotal yet totally ignored figure we need to talk about, Larry Itliong. He was known as Seven Fingers after losing 3 fingers working in incredibly dangerous labor conditions in an Alaskan cannery. Now, you might know about the famous 1965 Delano grape strike, but did you know Itliong actually started it? He led 1,500 Filipino workers off the farms a full week before Cesar Chavez and Mexican-American farm workers joined forces with them. Yet, despite this massive contribution to American labor rights, California didn't even add Itliong to its recommended school curriculum until 2015. No way, right? $3,000. That's it. In 1982, right in the middle of the American auto industry collapse in Detroit, 2 white auto workers blamed Japanese imports for their economic struggles. They ended up targeting a 27-year-old Chinese-American man named Vincent Chin, beating him to death with a baseball bat just days before his wedding. $3,000 was the mere fine his killers received. Along with 3 years of probation, neither man served a single day in prison for taking his life. Now compare the scapegoating of Vincent Chin in 1982 to what happened exactly 10 years later during the 1992 LA uprising. Following the acquittal of the officers who beat Rodney King, the city just erupted. But as the violence spread, the LAPD drew defensive perimeters solely around wealthier, whiter neighborhoods, deliberately leaving Koreatown without any police protection whatsoever. Over 2,200 Korean-American businesses were destroyed. That accounted for roughly half of all property damage citywide. Korean Americans refer to this tragic institutional abandonment as saegu. Moving on to Section 2, Unethical Science and Medicine. Back in the 1910s and 20s, the U.S. Radium Corporation hired teenage girls to paint glow-in-the-dark watch dials. They were actually instructed to lip-dip paint, literally shaping brushes covered in radioactive radium with their bare lips. Meanwhile, the company's own chemists were protecting themselves with lead screens and tongs. When the young women started suffering from disintegrating jaws and failing health, the company didn't help them at all. Instead, they hired investigators to falsely discredit the women by blaming their symptoms on syphilis. They effectively turned a fatal occupational hazard into a social death sentence just to dodge liability. And there is a clear, documented disparity in medical care that lasted for decades. Take the infamous Tuskegee study, starting in 1932. The U.S. Public Health Service told 399 black men they had bad blood, but in reality, they had syphilis. As penicillin became the standard cure nationwide, curing white patients across the country, the government deliberately withheld the treatment from these black men. They actually tracked them to ensure no other doctors cured them, simply to observe the fatal progression of the disease. At least 28 men died directly as a result, and absolutely no one was ever criminally prosecuted. 60,000. Between 1907 and, shockingly, as recently as the 2010s, over 60,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized under state eugenics laws. These laws explicitly targeted the poor, the disabled, people with mental illness, and, disproportionately, Black, Latina, and Native American women. The government systematically robbed tens of thousands of citizens of their reproductive rights. And the justification for this? It was cemented at the highest level of our legal system. In the 1927 Buck v. Bell decision, which legalized forced sterilization, Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. chillingly declared, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." That ruling wasn't just an American tragedy. California's eugenics program and this very legal framework directly inspired Nazi Germany's 1933 eugenics laws. And get this, to this day, the Supreme Court has never explicitly overturned Buck v. Bell.
All right, Section 3, State Violence and Betrayal. Let's examine the betrayal of Filipino veterans. In 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt promised full GI benefits to the Philippine Commonwealth Army fighting under the American flag. Over 260,000 Filipino soldiers fought, enduring horrors like the Bataan Death March. But then, in 1946, President Harry Truman signed the Rescission Act, a law that retroactively declared their service just didn't count. It stripped these veterans of $3 billion in promised benefits. Out of 66 allied nations in World War II, Filipino veterans were the only group singled out and betrayed exactly like this. 67. That is the massive number of nuclear weapons the United States detonated in the Marshall Islands between 1946 and 1958. To give you some scale here, the combined explosive force of those 67 tests was the equivalent of detonating more than 7,000 Hiroshima bombs. It's almost impossible to wrap your head around. And these atolls were not uninhabited. Residents were told they needed to relocate temporarily for the good of mankind. The testing literally vaporized entire islands, like El Jalab. The catastrophic impact of nuclear testing on Pacific Islander communities expanded even further when the government initiated Project 4.1. This was a classified study that turned the exposed radioactive Marshallese people into non-consenting research subjects. Justifying their return to contaminated homes, Health and Safety Lab Director Meryl Eisenbud stated, "These people are more like us than the mice." Truly unsettling. Meanwhile, over in Hawaii, the U.S. Navy seized the sacred island of Kaho'olawe after Pearl Harbor. For 50 years, they used this culturally vital land as a live-fire bombing range, even simulating nuclear blasts. Native Hawaiian activists fought tirelessly to protect it. In 1977, a 26-year-old activist named George Helm vanished at sea, trying to stop the military destruction. His body was never found. Today, even after the island was finally returned, roughly 25% of its surface remains dangerously contaminated with unexploded military ordnance. Then, from 1956 to 1971, the FBI ran a covert operation called COINTELPRO. They systematically targeted and disrupted civil rights and anti-war groups, culminating in the deadly suppression of activist groups. They actually mailed an anonymous letter urging Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to complete suicide. They also used an informant to orchestrate a 1969 raid in Chicago, where police fired up to 99 shots, assassinating 21-year-old Black Panther leader Fred Hampton while he slept next to his pregnant fiancée. State violence took many horrific forms. In 1985, Philadelphia police literally bombed their own city. Attempting to evict the Black liberation group MOVE, police dropped C4 explosives onto a residential row house from a helicopter. As the fire spread, police and fire commissioners gave the chilling order, "Let the fire burn." That decision killed 11 people, including 5 children, and destroyed 61 homes in a predominantly Black neighborhood. Which brings us to Section 4, the enduring consequences. Look, these historical events are deeply embedded in our present reality. The institutions responsible for these injustices continually fail to provide closure. For instance, that $1.5 million civil judgment owed to Vincent Chin's family, it remains largely unpaid decades later. The Tuskegee syphilis study is still cited today as a foundational cause of valid medical mistrust in Black communities. And it was recently revealed that a prominent university museum retained the bone fragments of children killed in the 1985 MOVE bombing, using their remains as props in an online forensics course without the family's consent or knowledge. So that brings us to the end of our explainer, and to this final provocative thought. If all of this, the massacres, the stolen land, the unethical experiments, the government bombings, was simply omitted from your history class, what else has been hidden? I challenge you to look beyond the sanitized curricula, actively seek out the marginalized narratives that truly shape this nation. Thanks so much for joining me today, and keep questioning the history you've been taught.